We are going to get started with our second roundtable of the day. For those of you who are just joining us, my name's Matthew Souls. I'm a professor in the architecture program at the UBC School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, otherwise known as SALA. Welcome to the Arthur Erickson Centennial Symposium. Arthur was born in Vancouver in 1924. Today's event is a collaboration between SALA and the Arthur Erickson Foundation, and it's part of really a long series of events, exhibitions, film premieres, lectures that started back in March 2024. So we're tremendously excited at SALA to be able to collaborate with the foundation and all the wonderful things that they're doing. Today's events are sponsored by the federal government, Government of Canada, and we're very grateful for their support. I would like to acknowledge that we are situated on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which has been stewarded by them since time immemorial. This is part of our fall lecture series today. We have 4 more events. Use this QR code to find out more about them. Also, I just want to remind everybody that we are filming this event and recording it, so just want to make sure you're comfortable with that. The recordings are going to be archived and be available for researchers moving forward. So we view this event as critical in the study, knowledge, and celebration of architecture and Arthur Erickson's legacy. The symposium right now is titled Living Labs, 3 Experimental Houses by Arthur Erickson, and it is moderated by my esteemed colleague, Leslie Van Duzer. Leslie is a professor at SALA and the past director of the school, and among her many accomplishments, she's sole authored and co-authored a tremendous number of books and monographs on architecture. I mean, a very impressive body of work that keeps growing. And I should mention part of our event series is a launch for her next book, which is about Bill Peckett. And I see Bill is in the audience right now. So we'll be having that event, learn about it on our website, and please come. So among her many books are the co-authored and co-edited, or books on Los's Villa Müller, quite amazing books, very influential, widely celebrated, and work on Mies van der Rohe's Crefeld Villas. So if you have not checked those books out, please do. They're very, very powerful. Also, in this part of the world, when Leslie arrived, I think it was in 2010, to assume the directorship position, she was awarded that position through an international search. She quickly, really embedded and immersed herself in the unique culture of this part of the world. And part of that was initiating a series of books, the West Coast Modern House series, or West Coast Modern Houses. She initiated that and sole authored the first book in that series on House Schumacher. Within that series is a book that I think you're going to hear maybe a little bit about, because one of the authors is here, on one of Arthur's houses, Smith House 2. So with that, I would please ask Leslie to take over and moderate today's session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I want to thank the staff also at SALA, thank David Kovo and the Arthur Erickson Foundation for putting together this day. I love town gown celebrations like this and relationships. So thank you for organizing this collaboration. So welcome everybody to this afternoon's panel, Living Labs, where the panelists are going to focus on 3 of Arthur's residential projects, the Filberg House, Smith House 2, and the Hilborn House. Following a brief introduction to the session, I'm going to turn things over to our panelists, and each of them are going to present for about 15 minutes before we come together for a discussion at the end. So let me start by introducing you to my 3 colleagues, and I would like to mention we have a journalist, an architect, and a historian, each of whom are going to bring a unique perspective to this session. So to start, Adele Weder has been described as an architectural writer, curator, and cultural journalist. And I want to add to that list. She's an independent scholar, vocal critic, and fierce advocate for our region's mid-century modern architectural heritage. Adele's engagement with West Coast modernism includes her 2005 master's thesis from SALA, focusing on the Binning House, and the founding of West Coast Modern League, a nonprofit society dedicated to promoting and preserving our region's modern architectural culture. In addition to Adele's prolific contributions to North American design journals and anthologies, she is also the author of 2 books, Prokopow in the series that Matthew mentioned, and another monograph, Ron Tom, Architect, The Life of a Creative Modernist. More recently, she has engaged with the West Vancouver Art Museum and the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria on curating a series of architecture-related exhibitions over the next 3 years. A big congratulations to you on that contract. That's pretty exciting, I would say. So this afternoon, Adele is going to address the rich story behind Arthur Erickson's 1959 Filberg House. Then we have Clinton Cuddington, who co-founded Measured Architecture in 2007 with Piers Cunnington. In less than 2 decades, the practice has produced an extensive portfolio of elegant houses, commercial interiors, and exhibitions. Prior to establishing Measured, Clinton worked for Bing Tom for 9 years, including as project architect for the area stage theater in Washington, D.C., and for the award-winning SFU Surrey campus. In addition to his practice, Clinton gives back to the architecture community in a variety of ways, as a frequent design critic at SALA, an Arthur Erickson Foundation board member, and as the instigator and editor of the 2004 book, Reside, Contemporary West Coast Houses, an examination of the enduring legacy of West Coast modernism. Clinton was entrusted with the renovation of the Smith House II, which will be the focus of his talk today, as well as the revitalization of Erickson's Danto residence. And as a member of the Arthur Erickson Foundation's programming committee, he's also is participating in the setup for the revitalization of Erickson's own house and garden. Clinton brings a unique and critical perspective to any discussion of the challenges presented by mid-century modern residential construction in our region. And finally, Dr. Michael Prokopow, cultural historian, curator, and professor at OCAD. He joins us today from Toronto to speak about Erickson's 1972 Hilborn House in Southern Ontario. As a longstanding member of the Arthur Erickson Foundation Board and a personal friend of Arthur's, he's among the many in this room with a deep knowledge of Arthur's life and practice. Dr. Prokopow has authored numerous books on art and architecture, including Smith House II, also in the SALA West Coast Modern House series, Antilu, Mono no Ma, Irving Anderson, and he authored Clinton Cuddington's brainchild, Reside, Contemporary West Coast Houses. So it's a little incestuous thing going on here. More recently, he co-edited The Place of Objects, the John David Lawrence collection, a companion to the exquisite and current 2025 VAG exhibition written in clay. He is a collector himself, and he also curated the traveling exhibition and accompanying catalog, many of you may have seen, True North, How Scandinavia Influenced Design in Canada. To every publication, exhibition, lecture, panel, and debate team, he joins. Dr. Prokopow brings a generous and probing intellect, a historian's critical perspective, and an unwavering ethical grounding. So please welcome our panelists. All right, so I have a little bit of imposter syndrome here because there's so many people in the room that know so much more about Arthur Erickson than I do. So I have to just start by offering a caveat that I am no expert on Arthur Erickson's work. Unfortunately, I never even had the pleasure to meet the dapper gentleman. Shortly after my arrival in Vancouver in 2010, I did, however, have the opportunity to join the Arthur Erickson Foundation board, and that offered this outsider a little peek inside. So my primary contribution to the board and, if you will, to scholarship on Arthur Erickson involved compiling lists. By collating the many existing and often conflicting lists, I tried my best to arrive at definitive lists of Arthur's projects, of his collaborators, of all the books and articles written about his work to date. Well, as it turns out, this was a surprisingly challenging undertaking, as there is a different answer to every question depending on how you ask it and who you ask. Who actually worked on the project, or who was employed in the office at the time? Does the project date start with the first client meeting or when the shovel hits the dirt? Which buildings are existing and which have been demolished? Even that question can be difficult to pin down. If a work has been substantially altered, is it still existing? So based on my experience researching other modern masters, specifically Mies van der and Adolf Loos, the earliest wave of publications that come out on these architects, they tend to be catalogs of projects, generally organized chronologically, written by those closest to the architects, their collaborators, and their admirers. These earliest books and articles are rarely critical, and they are generally full of errors, but they are foundational documentation. Basically, they're starting points. Let's call them round one. In Umberto Eco's book, The Infinity of Lists, he describes two kinds of lists. Those that are practical, like the lists I made for the foundation, or like most of the early publications on Arthur's work. And then there's another kind of list, lists that are more poetic, expansive, amorphous, lists with no boundaries. So as we celebrate Arthur's belatedly 101st birthday, 16 years after his passing, I think it's worth considering framing this great body of work in new ways. Having already cataloged it by program, residences versus educational buildings and government buildings, and by construction types, wood houses versus concrete houses, with that foundational and important work already done, it's exciting to think about fresh and more poetic ways to frame the work. We might still be a little bit close to the subject for a second wave of scholarship, a kind of wholesale re-examination, but I believe that this symposium serves to begin to open that door for new ways of looking at the work. And with that, I would like to ask Adele Weder to come up to lead off with her own take on the Filberg House.
Thank you, Leslie and Matthew and the entire Sala team. Before I forget, I'd also like to thank a few people who provided me with images and information, the West Vancouver Art Museum, Jeffrey and Chris Erickson, and most especially I'd like to give a shout out to Rob Gilbert at the wonderful Canadian Architectural Archives in Calgary, which is a national and underrated, under the radar institution. So I will be talking about the Filberg House, of course, and it's a good one to start with chronologically. It was started in late 1957 with the concept and completed in 1960. And as the first of these three houses, it's kind of like the foundation of a lot of his later ideas. He had done a few houses. The Smith House one, which Gordon Smith himself said was a disaster, and a few other houses in West Van. But the Filberg House was the first of his commissions to garner him national attention, to national renown. And it's also a crowd pleaser. Ironically or not, it's one of the few houses that Arthur said he wished he had done things differently. If years later on he'd design it differently, but it's Canadian House and Homes famously called it the most fabulous house in Canada, which I'm sure made him cringe, but there you have it. But it's really important to know, to remind, most of you already know this, just a reminder, what was going on in the years prior to his design. And there's two main direct formative influences to this house, I feel. And the first was the series of Neutra talks, which I know Arthur attended, and at least one of them, where Richard Neutra did talk about his groundbreaking benchmark book, Mystery and Realities of the Site, published in 1951. And it's hard to overstate the impact of this on the West Coast. This was obviously pre-internet. It was even pre-prolific design press, and it was prior to visits by foreign architects being a regular thing. And so Neutra, he basically made this powerful manifesto for the importance of integrating the site and considering it as part of the architecture. It's so obvious now, but it was not obvious then. The de facto default way of treating a site is to just transform it into a level plane, a neutral canvas. And so he famously encouraged everyone, exhorted them to treat it as contiguous with the architecture and to continue it as such. So, and Arthur and Peter Oberland and Cornelia and the other West Coast pioneering modernists, they as Peter wrote in one text, we sort of intuitively were getting this, but Neutra articulated it and he synthesized it and he turned it into this compact manifesto. And it was so influential on everyone. You can almost say that West Coast modernism before and after the Neutra talks. So this is the Filberg House. And, you can just see how Arthur consciously or unconsciously basically had absorbed Neutra. It's a constructed site. It's a fantastic 7 acres in the middle of the Comox Valley. And he and his client, Rob Filberg, actually, they modulated the site, which is part of Neutra's thing, to make it that the house could nestle into the site. Now, the program of the site, here are the other main influence aside from Neutra was his travels in the Middle East and Europe several years earlier. And, the Alhambra was an obvious influence. You don't have to think of it literally, but conceptually as the kind of lightness and delicacy that he saw in the Alhambra. And he'd gone through Florence, which he sort of regretted later in terms of its influence. And I'm just quoting from an interview he had done that's cited in David Stokes' biography about where he's sort of relaying indirectly the influence, the conceptual influence. Is it sort of ethereality? It's not heavy. And yet the Filberg House, you'll see it's sort of a bifurcated house. It's got these two, it's a very horizontal house, but the first level is very solid. It's granite, and the second level is incredibly light and lofty, more like what we think of as the Alhambra, feeling you get when, having walked in both places, I had a similar sense of joy and luminosity in both of those structures. And then when we get to this pervasive luminosity, as Arthur called it, that's really key to, I should mention what the design brief is, because it's a unique design brief. It's designed to be a cultural center for visiting world leaders with a live-in apartment for the client who suffered from serious depression and alcoholism. And I'm a journalist, so I'm always nosy about people's personal lives. But in this case, the personal life is extremely pertinent to the architectural design because as part of the design brief, he explicitly tried to make it a house that would bring him joy, his client joy, and alleviate his depression through lots of light, lots of beauty. And the fact that it was a cultural center would give him a sense of purpose that he was adrift at, because he was the son of the most powerful lumber baron on the West Coast, or at least in Vancouver Island, Robert Filberg Sr., who was a ruthless acquisitor of wealth and power. He was severely disappointed with his son's lack of interest in following in his footsteps. He was severely disappointed in his son's gay orientation and basically disowned him. And so coincidentally or not, Rob Jr.'s mother, Rob Sr.'s wife, committed suicide 2 years earlier. So there's a lot of reasons to be mentally anguished. The theme of this seminar is experimental houses. Well, Arthur's experiment was partly through, just an architect's natural penchant for trying out new materials and new ways of doing things, but is also an experiment about whether to make someone happy. And this was an intimate personal friend of Arthur's, and he himself said, "I felt like I was racing against time." And it helps to explain why, a house like this, which here's some lovely sketches. Here it looks like it could be a cultural center or a place for world leaders to gather, but when you think about it, here's the plan. It's a very straightforward plan. You can see how compact it is. There's no way that world leaders would come to the Comox Valley and gather in a 1.5 bedroom house with 1.5 bathrooms and discuss world affairs with transparent glass walls all around them. So you think, well, was that just Arthur, and his client just not? It's a loony design brief, but it was, again, he was racing against time and he was creating a sense of purpose. That, he explicitly said to his biographers that he was trying to create something that would both make him happy and also provide him with a sense of purpose that his family, his father, had denied him. So very straightforward. It's interesting in the elevations, you don't see the curvilinearity that you see in that loftiness. I'm not sure if that evolved that way as he built. But here's I chose to actually, most of the shots, I'm just going to do these vintage black and white shots because I love black and white, even though the house, the colors are amazing in the house, but the black and white gives a sort of, you sort of focus more on the architecture, I find. So I was happy to find these from the Canadian Architectural Archives. I love this little void in the kitchen cabinetry that got lost in one of the renovations, but that strikes me as very Arthur, levitating the top drawer above the base cabinets. And you can also see, again, really commonplace now, totally radical at the time, or at least very unusual to have these wraparound glazing so that the entire surroundings, the house became a panopticon to the view. Again, that was both for the idea of world leaders having a great vision and also for his client to feel maybe there's a wider world beyond his father's narrow world. And they just compositionally, of course, being Arthur, they all look like, beautiful movie stills. And the hearth, the open hearth, so that it's open so that, again, you have this sense of pervasive light. And this I just threw in, like, that's where he kind of said the Filberg House, rather fancy. Like, everyone loves, when I say everyone, I think that it's one of the few Erickson houses that everyone, even, the rest of the world, outside of this room loves. Ordinary, I don't want to say ordinary people as though you're abnormal, but you know what I mean. Non-architects love it. They find it very beautiful and that it speaks to them. The same way we all love Florence, and including non-architects. But, it'll be interesting to see the next two houses where he does reduce it. He does adopt a much higher level of clarity to his house. And here is a picture of Arthur in the house shortly after its completion. alone. His client has passed away. He died 2 months before its completion. So a lot of this is relevant too, and I'm going to sound a little bit prurient, but there's a reason for it. Like it's widely reported, even in regular newspapers and even amongst scholars, that it's believed, they just say his client committed suicide shortly before it was completed. And I was saying, oh, shucks, we can't really find out if it was worked or not, his experiment. In reality, although his mother and later his sister committed suicide, Rob Filberg actually died. Arthur told him, his biography, that he died of semi-accidentally after a bout of drinking of alcohol-related asphyxiation. So he didn't actually commit suicide. And I think that's really important to, it's not just a tawdry personal detail. It's significant to the architecture because it doesn't mean the architecture failed. It means that he died accidentally. So he had faith in we can believe that he had faith in Arthur's vision, and it may well have brought him over the hump. I think it may not have been world leaders gathered, but he might have found another purpose once the house was built. Then I'm going to, I don't know where I'm at. There's two little scholarly things here. That one's very formal, dry, scholarly description of the two forces of a structure, and one is the inner force. What I think of as prosaically as the end user, how whether it works, do you like it? And then the external circumstances that architects have to consider: site, climate, economics, etc. And beside this, and later, this is the most compelling reading that I actually reread it before this presentation. The first time I thought this exercise, that's this famous exercise that actually formed the title of Edith Iglauer's book on Arthur, The Seven Stones. I thought it was an exercise that was very clever to hone and tone one's creative mind. And then once your creative mind is nice and muscled, you can use those muscles in other ways for architecture. And when I reread it, I thought of it in a different way. Is that my warning? Okay, I've got 45. Okay, you can guess the rest. Sorry. No, okay, just do read this so you choose 7 stones, you present your project. That's 7 stones. So, some of them came back 3 weeks later. Some of them danced with them. Some glued them to cardboard. And one, and this is the killer, one got 7 beautiful stones, presented them in a velvet box, and he clanked them together for everyone to hear. So it was a performance. And Arthur looked at him and said, "Why are you wearing a blue sweater?" And the student said, "Well, that has nothing to do with the problem." And Arthur said, "Well, yeah, no, it's a performance, and your clothing is part of it." And so after reading the previous one, I said, the blue sweater, you apply that to architecture, like his family is the blue sweater. This is my black part, because this is what we can speed through this, because this is where he lost the house, and then the death of his client, the house was sold, went through a change of ownerships. It finally got beautifully restored after a bad stucco-covered alteration, and right now it's sold by Remax. Chris Erickson has proposed an addition, but the house is actually in civic forfeiture right now because for tax evasion and various other mushroom growing activities. And it's on Airbnb. You can rent it, $9,500 a month, 3-month minimum. If we all went together, I think we could do it. So the Airbnb shots I actually like a lot because they're very straightforward. There's no filters, no editing, but yeah, there's lots of room, sleeping bags. And it's, I don't think Arthur would be too crazy about this bed. So very lonely shot at there's 2 chairs empty, just think that should be Arthur and Rob sitting there. But there you go. And then that's the final shot. Just I chose a kind of a suitably somber shot just to conclude this presentation as an early sketch. And all we can do is, its future is uncertain. West Coast Modern League is monitoring it, and we can just cross our fingers for a happier, more architecturally sensitive future. Thank you.
Okay, I have to apologize to all the researchers in advance because this will not be scholarly. I'm glad I'm in the middle between the two, but I come to the work in a different way. And I'll just attempt to talk through the experience we had working on the Smith 2 house, because I think it's important to understand that that ultimately the way in which we think about the work, the legacy, the preservation of Arthur's work, is interconnected not only to the critical footholds that and concept that Arthur brought to the table, but also what are the impacts of the users moving forward in order to protect the building. And it's exciting when one can unearth a series of quotes that reinforce and entrench the notion that that Arthur felt strongly that the user was the critical informant to the way in which the building was to unfold. Maybe I'll go back here for a second, or just quickly. You'll not get what the level of history in regards to the project on purpose, and I'll explain that moving forward. But effectively, a 1,600 square foot building, West Vancouver, constructed 63 to 66. $35,000, reported to be pretty much in on budget because Marion would not allow it to be over budget, as I've learned. So just to contextualize the piece, Arthur met Gordon and Marion in 1940 and made their first house in 53, the Smith 1 house, Erickson-designed. Important. That is a house that effectively, I'm not here to talk about today, but as I understand it, is a house that had an Erickson rigor to it that we won't see moving forward in the Smith 2 house. Arthur traveled through Japan in 61 on a Canada Council grant. 63 receives a commission for SFU. I place that off the side to begin to talk about the kind of work that is being done simultaneously to the residential work, because I feel that there is a narrative around test studies in the residential work that precede an earlier work. There's others here that can confirm that beyond myself. 64, the Smith 2 house happens. After that is the MOA project. And one can begin to see a lot of commonalities between the type of structural propositions, the tectonics that are laid out in the Smith 2 house, in the MOA project. And then critical to the story I want to tell is that Marion and Gordon asked Arthur to consider a painting studio as he outgrew the space and was being confined with the studio in the main house. And Arthur flatly said no, that there should be no other building on the property. So a new type of experimentation occurs where other architects start to enter into the equation, looking to those critical footholds in the building, and Hollingsworth Architecture takes on 1989 work. 2021, we're fortunate to be brought into the conversation. I think it's important to understand that Arthur thought a lot about the way in which the buildings were integrated into the site, and how the diagnosis of the site would allow for placement of the building to protect. So that's parts of the site. This is an early walkthrough that Arthur would have had of the site. Simply put, there is two rock outcrops with a view out to the ocean and a fern-covered rift in between. So effectively, the building is being thought of on that site, Cowboy Corner, pushed into the corner in order to save and preserve the best parts of the site for viewing and on-look, both short view, long view propositions. And this is how the house lays out. So as many of us hopefully have been to the Smith 2 house, but this is how it unfolded initially. It was quite a modest proposition and does not have all of the terracing that one would see now. And I think that's quite important. This is a workerly house. It is a house that I think has a type of austerity to it that I think helps land this premise that not only is the site an informant, but the need sets and the limits of the ownership help constrain Arthur's vision. And again, a critical quote, it starts to build this notion of a schism that, while the demands of the site and the family are paramount in the development of a site, it does still clash with this notion that Arthur felt that the project was complete and that he did not feel that changes should be made to it. So that sets up something interesting, because I think the power and presence of that building did allow for others' involvement with deep respect. So I introduced Marion and Gordon. I was going to show a picture of Marion, but I think this is far more appropriate. This was Marion's house. The second house was a house that was meant to have a type of edit, so I understand. And I think you can begin to really see that in the house. You can begin to see it in the way in which the austerity and building materials, construction techniques, etc., are played out. And I think that the honesty of that has definitely been an informant for our firm in the way in which one can grapple between coarse meets fine. Some of the critical things in the design that are of importance, if you look at the earlier work of the Baldwin House in '63, you begin to see a narrow column proposition placed on a thickened post condition. And I think that my read in regards to this, because I don't do a deep dive into this, I'm simply trying to understand it, understand this enough to move forward with the work as an architect, is that there was a goal to try and begin to bring the post and beam into a unification in order to allow for it to recede and become a backdrop for the inhabitants and the work of two critical makers, a weaver and a painter. And this quote sets up the notion that while there appears to be a rigor when one looks at the space and this helix that develops in the building, that he wasn't bound or paralyzed by that rationalism, that he allowed for a flourish to occur, and he never let structure dictate. So here's an example in the dining room that, in order to complete the need to create a space that's containing, maintains a certain type of massing, he introduced faux beams in the house as well. Nerve-wracking, as I'll allude to further, because sometimes you don't know what structure and what isn't when you're in a remediation strategy, as we've learned. There is conversation that Arthur alluded to, that he, and I think it's this tea house in Kyoto, where he was incensed by it because it had 3 different landing points of a column. One was on a log, one was on a rock, one was on the ground plane, and it pissed him off. And because it didn't show a level of rigor, and he said he was going on a hunger strike until he figured this out. But it later dawned on him that it was the site specificity that began to dictate and allow for him to loosen up his approach. And I feel we begin to see that stance taken up in the work of the Smith 2 house, in that he utilized it as an organization for a series of moments or nodes within the house, each playing to different sites of view, whether it is a studio proposition upon entry, or a dining room view to a terrace, a living room back into the forest, or a bedroom tight into an intimate condition with the forest. And I believe this comes out of that initial fury in Kyoto about why would an architect break from rigor? So this is sort of where we begin to enter the picture. That think about the what is the fundamental role of this building, and it was very clear that this was meant to be a place for hosting, and whether it hosted Pierre Elliott Trudeau in his fine baby blue leisure suit, or whether Arthur, as many of you had a chance, he was able to continue to bring people together, to utilize architecture as backdrop, as a leap point for future conversations. And I'm happy that on the far right, that my client, that the new stewards of the building, the Smith II House, has been entrusted to Dinah and Andy, and they too consider this space to be a working vessel to support ongoing conversations in architecture and art. Michael Prokopow, dear friend, helps immensely, not only in his comments in regards to the Smith II House as being thought of not as a shrine or something that we need to preserve in a state of paralysis, but something that we can think of as a building that has fundamental purposes, but can and is strong enough to handle a type of interrogation to ensure that it remains relevant and successful over time, and as a host. The work that Hollingsworth did in 1989 is the painting studio that Arthur said could not be, modifications to bathrooms, studio expansions, and the landscape terrace that is so critical now to the work that to the gathering that, as you saw with Dinah and Andy. And these are some of the shots of the work that Hollingsworth had done. That became really important for our entry into the equation, because Dinah and Andy had thought that road had been paved and they could develop a similar relationship with Measured to begin to think about the building as Gordon and Marion did with Hollingsworth. Scary proposition, terrified. We have projects that often you'd think of a historic house as a host for contemporary interventions. And I'll say that the presence and power of the Smith II House kept us in line, and I felt absolutely satiated to look. Well, Donald Luxton's here in the room. He has been a guiding light for our firm in regards to the notion that one should always look for the canvases that are always available within any project. And sometimes they're non-meritorious interventions that have taken place over time, or sometimes there's just simply antiquated spaces that no longer serve the critical functions that would ensure that these buildings make it through time. So our firm, my connection through to Arthur is not that I knew Arthur, I met him, but it's learning Arthur's lessons through Bing for effectively a decade. My business partner, Piers, was fortunate enough to get those critical foundations out of Shim and Bridget Shim Sutcliffe, and we were very lucky to have that kind of rigorous foundation. So with that, we're thankful that we've been entrusted to stabilize the patient of the Danto residence, the Smith II House, as we've talked, and beginning to work on the programming of the Erickson House and Garden. Robin, who owns the Danto House, said to me that she kind of thinks about owning an Erickson house in a similar manner as one might have a need to restore a painting. She has a corner painting that's sublime. She took it in to get it restored and found out the price of the restoration was 4 to 5 times the cost of the painting, but it was worth it for her to do it. And she said, that's why I want to fix Arthur's damn house. But this brings some, I quake in my boots because I got to bring A game to any type of intervention because I got to answer to that person, and that could be a scary day. And while I have David Kovo's guiding hand at all times of how to think about how our firm can come to the work of the preservation of Erickson's work and legacy, there's a rigor in Phyllis's interrogation of what the role is. And I'm largely sitting on the foundation to answer that question to next generations of makers. Why is this important to do this? And it's important, when I spent time with Dinah and Andy talking about the Smith II house, they asked a really tough question. They said, had the building lived out its life, should we carry on to restore the painting? Or has it done its job and we should take it down? And they needed to answer that question in order to remain invested in what those canvases were to move forward. Because this is, I'll call it an experiment in structural propositions, but the reality is I think it was more of a free-form proposition. This is an image of a rotted fascia board under the main living complex. We pulled it off and to repair it, and found out that this stuff is stick built. Like, these are layers and layers of scrap material bound together, and that fascia board was structural. So there's no roadmap for that. So we learn as we go. Unfortunately, in this scenario, fortunately, the building immediately began to smile with the elimination of this, but we were able to save the single paned plate glass. It made it all the way through until an individual was starting to work to clean the putty off of it, and he ticked it, and the whole thing blew. So we have now worked to create a roadmap for splinting over time. So we repair one piece, and then they have the specification to fix the remainder. But what was important is we wanted to understand what the house needed. What did the patient need? What are the places in the building that needed to be preserved in order to maintain the vision of the original project? And then what are the need sets? These are the lists from the client, and there were a lot of lists. And we had to begin to think about how to bring those together in a manner that did not undermine or disrupt the primary dwelling proposition. But we wanted to make sure that the canvas was open so that the client could carry on, because this is an Erickson house, but it's also Marion and Gordon's house as well. When they entrusted Donna and Andy to take over the house, the last thing they said to them is, make it yours. And that was incredibly important because, as I'm receiving, I don't know if there's any members of the Erickson family here, but I got phone calls. Thank God you're on the case. I hope you're going to do everything in your power to revert the building back to its brine finish, that Gordon and Marion could no longer maintain because they were aging in place, and they couldn't put this slurry on. So they painted it green, and that, in conjunction with handrails and pulls for Gordon, the decision was made that this is as important as the Erickson house to work to celebrate those layers. But meaningful conversations took place with Michael about, should those handrails come off? What we landed on is that the critical long views needed to be preserved, but that the voice of Marion and Gordon should remain, and then the canvas should be opened up to the next generation. So this is the work that Measure did. Here's the original Massey Erickson kitchen of '64, the Hollingsworth kitchen that was deemed to be antiquated, and then a goal to bring forward a contemporary proposition that might utilize some of the materials that Arthur would embrace if he had them available. As an example, a Vancouver Island marble, but working sensitively to look to the cues of the original building. But the client wanted to talk about what are the colors, so these were some of the studies in different colors to the building. But ultimately, we landed on this in order to bring the coloration of the outside in. And to align with Michael's wishes and goals of the house to ensure that the island that you see in the long view axis is on wheels and can get the hell out of there in order to allow for flexibility of use, but allow for the house to revert back. We filled in there's an artist in residency program, so this was a filling in of the utility sink for the studio and the creation of a bathroom so that the house could continue to operate as a place for artist in resident. These are some of the cleanup shots once we finished the work of tidying it up, and I hope we did what we could in order to maintain and preserve it. These are shots before the furniture went back in, complete with Gordon and Marion's green stain. Sorry, Jeffrey. So the last shots. So to entrench and conclude, my supposition is that while Arthur may not have wished for someone else to touch the building in such a profound way over time that Hollingsworth did and we were involved in, I do believe that the site and the building were strong enough and had enough cues within it to allow for next generations to continue to evolve the building to ensure that it doesn't hit landfill. So thank you for listening to that.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Such a privilege to talk about the work of Mr. Erickson. And I want to thank my colleagues for giving me new things to ponder as I'm going to give my talk about the Hilborn House. So I decided a lecture always needs a title, and the more words in a title means the less words I have to offer to you. So in fact, this is the talk in the title, and the rest will be filler. Poetic License and Critical Regionalisms, Arthur Erickson's 1974 Hilborn House, as a negotiation of aesthetic experience and domestic precedents to the topography and settler culture of Southern Ontario. There's a lot in that title, but there's a lot in the Hilborn House. It's the only masonry house built in Ontario, in fact, by Arthur Erickson. In fact, it's the only house that Mr. Erickson built in that part of the country. And in talking to him, which I did extensively about the house, it was very clear that when he was given the commission, which came about in one of those interesting conversations that takes place on a phone call about an experience. The Hilborns had been to Expo. They had seen Mr. Erickson and Mr. Massey's pavilion. They liked the work in wood. They said, we'd like you to build us a house on a piece of land, a small piece of land on the Grand River, which if you know Southern Ontario, it's in the town of Preston, which is close to the now consolidated town and municipality of Cambridge. It's about 50 miles from Toronto. The Grand River, Indigenous land, no longer inhabited by Indigenous people. Mr. Erickson, and this is germane, was aware of the deep Indigenous history of the place and the subsequent settler histories of this part of Southern Ontario. The introduction of agriculture, the clearing of land, the introduction of railways and other types of technologies. The Hilborns had heard that Mr. Erickson was at Toronto International Airport, and they rushed out to see him. And in that conversation, there was the proverbial but actual sketch on a napkin in an airport restaurant, and the decision to move forward with the house was made. The thing about the Hilborn House is, as I would argue, and I should parenthetically say, the thing about architectural criticism is twofold. There are the archival documents that allow scholars, as we have seen in today's really superb presentations, to go deep into the materials that are generated in the context of creativity, construction, and all. But that's only part of the story. Any type of record source is as much about what we can read as about what we don't have access, the interstices and the missing pieces. And there is a temptation, I think, in light of Mr. Erickson's deep place in so many people's hearts and in the national conversation about architecture, to turn the absence of actual information into a type of quasi-hagiography. There's no doubt that Mr. Erickson is beloved, and no doubt that his reputation in this country and beyond is special. But for the architectural critic, there is that tension between wanting to get an interpretation at least plausible, if not absolutely right, while at the same time honoring a type of legacy. And so I can say off the record, Mr. Erickson and I talked often about the Hilborn House because he thought it was a misunderstood and understudied and very special exercise in his design thinking. And I will tell you why. So the image on the top is the sketch made on a napkin or a piece of paper. And I would argue in looking at it simply as a diagram of what might be, we see a number of precedents, cultural and actual, in terms of his creative and critical design process. The image directly below is a historic photograph of the house at the time of its completion, about 2 years after. And you'll see that, in fact, he covered the roofs with vegetation. There are barrel-vaulted glass elements over what was a sauna, sort of an indoor-outdoor sunroom, and a pool. And then the image to the right, the large image, is a current image that you can find on the website of Sotheby's Canada because the Hilborn House is now on the market. And I had the great pleasure of being able to go see the Hilborn House last week. Now, in all the time that I talked to Mr. Erickson about this and other houses, he always said, you need to go and see the Hilborn House. You need to walk the site and you need to go to the edge by the river. But the Hilborns who commissioned the house and the subsequent owner were very private. It's not a house that's easily found. It sits surprisingly in a type of cul-de-sac suburban area in Preston. It's a house that is characteristically out of place, but it's absolutely exquisitely in place. So it's surrounded by, very nice and well-intentioned, modest suburban bungalows. And then you see, upon entering into this heavily wooded and steeply descending lot, this remarkable structure. And so this is the photograph that Sotheby's has presented. And just if you're noticing carefully, you can see that the atrium spaces have been remade. And in fact, the barrel vaulting is gone, and now there are new forms. Well, the house, I would argue, represents Mr. Erickson's deep interest in the idea of the experience of unfolding space. Now, there's been many references today about Mr. Erickson's formative experiences of travel, whether it was his walk around the Mediterranean after graduating from McGill, or his subsequent Canada Council time in Japan, which I think, as we've heard today, was profound in giving him what I would call a type of aesthetic peace. He was deeply stimulated by the architecture and culture of Japan, and that experience of his time there and the legacies of looking at both historic architecture and Katsura Villa was of deep significance to him, but also the work of Kenzo Tange and others. And that legacy he brought with him in the work of the 1960s. We can look at what Ms. Weder told us about the Filberg House, and I was always struck that that house, to my mind, is not Florentine, it's Mughal. It's something about Indian architecture and brise soleil in the way that light filters through architecture. But Mr. Erickson used the words he used, and he said Florentine, so we will go with that. The one thing about Mr. Erickson, if you ever asked him about any project, he would disavow everything. So in an article in the book published by the Vancouver Art Gallery on masterworks of Mr. Erickson, there's an essay by Mr. Stalder, a very good scholar, and he argues that several references can be seen in Arthur Erickson's wood and concrete buildings to torii, Japanese gates. And I remember once at dinner, Mr. Erickson said, categorically not. I don't reference architecture in such obvious ways. I'd be like, all right, and maybe it's in latent ways. And given what Mr. Cuddington showed us about Mr. Erickson's comment about the superconscious, the idea of what's embedded in the back of one's mind, it might be arguable that his creative process, and he was decidedly a genius, and we have to remember, he started off at a precocious young age as a painter and a sculptor. At age 15, he had a show of his work at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Lauren Harris said, you can be a sculptor and you need to make three-dimensional objects. But his mother, formative influence, said painting was his thing. Then we know the Frank Lloyd Wright story, and then he becomes a maker of buildings that are never not at once remarkable exercises in sculpture and also places for habitation. The idea that we occupy buildings, and in doing so, we make them part of us, and they offer themselves to us for us to be. Well, the Hilborn House, I would argue, takes the precedence of Japan in certain ways, and the precedence of his profound work in this part of the world. We think about the Baldwin House, which has been talked about. We think lamentably about the Graham House, one of the great works of Mr. Erickson that went to the wrecking ball because of the inadequate and problematic jurisdictional avoidances, the idea that money and land is worth more than culture and heritage. So if we look at this house, it was featured in Architectural Record. And if you look down, you can see it's identified on a bold house in Eastern Canada by Arthur Erickson. And here is a photograph by the very distinguished architectural photographer who worked with Mr. Erickson, who I will see in a minute. It's sort of, okay, it's slightly out of view. The Architectural Record article is useful, I think, for our purposes of figuring out the house. It said, this house by one of Canada's most distinguished architects is, in his words, quote, a series of terraces contained between vertical brick panels. Pretty apt description. These panels are the strongest element in the concept and determine both the form and spaces, reflecting and reinforcing the qualities of an unusually open site along a river in Ontario. Now, I think Simon Scott, who did these photographs, did a really remarkable job in capturing what Mr. Erickson was seeking to do. As I say, if you go to the site, it does descend rather quickly. There are a number of suburban houses on either side. One very close by happened to be owned by the parents of Mr. Hilborn. And then there was a house to the other side of the lot, which the Hilborns took down in acquiring the lot. But the family owned much of the riverfront of what was Anishinaabe original territory. Well, A Bold House in Eastern Canada by Arthur Erickson, back to the title. And it is bold in the sense that Mr. Erickson was interested in making sure that his client's desire for a house that would be at once private, but in the majority public. It was a place of parties, a place of celebration, a place of family gatherings, a place of business. And he created a house that is striking in the sense that there are a number of public rooms, and I'll show you them in plan. But he also melded interesting types of activities. The living room goes directly into a remarkable pool, and you can see that in the far image to the right. If you go to the house today, and I think Mr. Cuddington makes very clear that houses do evolve. There's that remarkable book, How Buildings Learn, and we can think about the changes that can take place over the life course of a building in the service of life and in the service of preservation. And I think the Hilborn House is one of those places that I would say off the record in the contemporary has suffered. It's been a house gilding the lily. If you look at the Smith House materially, Mr. Erickson was very much interested in rock-cut cedar, and many of the interior members have this remarkable structural members have this very remarkable physical surface. He used the same type of cedar in the building this house. Cedar slats in the roof, yellow brick, locally made in Ontario for the floor, and this idea of these vistas, and it's the vistas about which I want to talk. So this is a house that descends down this cliff. The distance between the front edge of the house, or the river-fronting edge of the house, and the cliff, 10 feet. There are no guardrails, there's just foliage, and you have to be very mindful. If you go to the edge, you can very easily tumble down. The image on the right shows the house stepping down what Mr. Erickson called benchland, the idea of a topography that changes rather rapidly in small sort of terraced areas. The original plan for the house was in many ways referencing, as I say, the Graham House and anticipating, although I don't talk about it very much here, or I won't be talking about it, the first epic house, the idea of a complex site where there is this sort of staring down, stepping down on houses. Well, I want to show you two images that I find just remarkable, characteristic of Mr. Erickson in the world. And I said at the beginning, the thing about architectural criticism is we have objects, buildings are objects, and we can read them on the surface and we can decide maybe what period they were created in or around, the materials that were used, and we can ask questions as to why. We can look at massing, how does it work in space as an occupiable entity? And we can ultimately think about aesthetics, how does it work as a piece of sculpture? And Mr. Erickson often would say that the key to making a building work was certainly recognizing program and client need, but particularly about how does it sit in a place. Now we could talk about site, and he was very sensitive to landscape and about it should be a gentle footprint in a landscape, and I think he was gifted and preternaturally sensitive rather than the sort of heavy-handed approach. But I think there's something else about Mr. Erickson that, if we go back to the idea of the superconscious mind, he was a profoundly poetic intellectual sponge, and he gathered things all the time, and they carried with him. Well, I want to go to Katsura Villa. If you ever had the opportunity to hear Mr. Erickson talk about Katsura, he would say it was a profound experience. And one of the things that he thought was most striking about it, and it is an imperial villa in Kyoto, as I know you all know, and it has several places, or in terms of its orientation, it's as much about lunar experience as sunshine. It's as much about rain and water as it is about trees. But he said the most important thing about it is the idea of landscapes within a domestic setting that open up. Add to that Mr. Erickson's interest in the topography of where he was raised in settler Vancouver on Indigenous land of profound natural beauty. Mr. Erickson was always interested in the idea of looking at horizon lines, islands in oceans, and you would see different colorations, lines that would sort of descend in. And I think Katsura gives us some clue to what he tried to do in the Hilborn House. The idea of doors opening up and what we see beyond. Now, in designing the Hilborn House, he understood he needed to make terraces. He wanted to make what he called tubes, structural tubes, namely the interior spaces between those walls that look like shear walls. And the house reads both horizontally in terms of these very strong lines of masonry that move up a hill. But once you're inside the space, the orientation is not out to the river. There are vistas, but they're sort of crowded by trees, so you don't really see the river. But when you're in the house and you look to the left or to the right, you get other vistas. So here's Katsura, just to give you a sense. It's a peaked roof building, but just keep it in mind as a type of exercise in planning. Here is the lamented Graham House. Again, one of the great tragedies, I think, in this part of the world. But we can see, again, an exercise in which a steep lot invites the architect to create a series of pavilions that are linked. And the visual orientation of the house, of course, is out to the ocean, hence its destruction, valuable piece of land. But in fact, as he would tell us, he was interested in the interior experience, sort of phenomenological reality of being in a house where the view that might seem to be the one that should beckon is the one you resist. And you look to other ones that might be less expected, that might be quieter and softer. The Smith House, a similar type of idea in what I call a type of creation of horizontal volumes. Well, if we go back to the idea of criticism and what are the inspirations that an architect might have? As I say, Mr. Erickson would always be one who would say, absolutely not, absolutely not, absolutely not. But he did say one night, having dinner with Rob Feeney, just to put a little bit of Vancouver experience in the mix, I said, so when you were doing this project, he said, well, I drove around a lot. I just wanted to look at Southern Ontario. And this is the remains of a railway bridge. It's very close to the house. And now I'm not arguing that this is a direct correspondence, but Mr. Erickson called the house a ruin, and it was known as a fortress and a rampart. And these were words used at the time of its creation. Another drawing, we see sort of what he does. He put green roofs on all of the structures, this cascading arrangement, another image of the bridge. I'm not saying that he was inspired by a derelict rain bridge in creating a house of masonry walls, but it doesn't mean he wasn't. And I think the thing about architectural criticism in light of his rather, step back approach to things is I think there's benefit in informed speculation. The house today has mahogany interiors. It's been, as I say, rather sort of embellished in ways that I think Mr. Erickson would find dismaying. In the basement, there are extant cedar doors akin to those that we find in the Smith House, the floor brick, and the ceiling panel. And then I just want to think about this young person who started off as a preternatural genius who was interested in the world of experience and aesthetics, who then became, the movie star architect of Vancouver, who then became the distinguished person that we celebrate and acknowledge today, and who always would want to be challenged. He may not have wanted to reveal his secrets, but he always was up for a very good conversation about creativity and practice. Thank you very much. And anyone's interested, $4 million, and it's available as we speak.
Much cheaper to rent the Filberg House.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thank you all very much for your presentations. I'm just going to start by saying, I'm thinking about where the scholarship on Arthur Erickson can go. That's my concern. We talked this morning about Dave, I believe it's your own PhD student, David, who's doing oral histories now. Not yours, okay, but at McGill. And the importance of gathering oral histories now from many of the people in this room and elsewhere. And then what? You all talked on, Adele, you focused very much on the client and the history of that client's life and how it related to the commission. Clinton, your talk was a little broader, but also focused on sort of the afterlife of the building, and Michael very much about the space and the landscape and the relationship of the building to the site. And in what I'm hoping for are more very deep monographs on individual buildings, because we have now a lot of books that kind of survey and are descriptive. And in my own experience doing monographs on single buildings, it requires understanding all of these things, understanding the siding of the building, the construction of the building, the attitude toward the construction. The client's life is no small thing. It's actually extremely important for understanding how decisions were made in a building. So I'm personally kind of hoping that that might be the next wave. And it's something that younger scholars can do quite easily, take on a single building and write a book about that building. And that can start a kind of wave of deep scholarship and criticism. I think that's also very important, is to move beyond just descriptions, to become more critical of the work, and that may need some more distance. So I want to just throw that out there to you all and see if you have any thoughts about that, about the next, where you think the next wave of scholarship on Erickson's work might go. You have any thoughts about that?
I'm probably the least scholarly of you three, but speaking as somebody on the other side of practice, looking at practice, I find that one impediment to serious scholarship and coverage in writings about architecture is the reluctance of the design press and the architectural community to accept honest criticism, stark criticism. Architects come up to me all the time and say, we need you to be more critical. Come on, we need more criticism in newspapers and magazines, as long as it's not about them, because when it is, there's just the editors and the writers never hear the end of it. And I would imagine, but in academia, you probably have a better idea, that my feeling is that there's this, you use the term hagiography, Michael, that you can't touch Arthur. I think that obviously he's a brilliant architect, but a couple of his buildings have serious programmatic challenges. I mean, UBC Robson Square's never worked as intended. There's other buildings where I think it's fair comment to say that they're aesthetically challenged. And you can't even when it's subjective, you cannot say that. And it's verboten. And I think that's an impediment to real, honest scholarship.
Okay. My thought is, architects are always looking for their brief. So from my the things that I'm most concerned about are how to allow for these buildings to continue to work. And therefore we need the footholds necessary in order to understand what's important about them. And that's not only so that an architect has a roadmap to make a determination about how to alter them, as they will. Stewardship brings with it a need to continue to protect these buildings, repair these buildings. Brian should be up here talking about what the footprint of a repair on an Erickson building is, watching over the house and garden. But these buildings are gifts, and they are curses simultaneously. And I am always looking for what can allow for the building to move forward and move out of a state of paralysis so that we can touch them, and change the definition of protection to prevent them from becoming shrines. I think that if buildings move to that state of protection, then we start moving into a conversation about curation, which ones make it, which ones don't, rather than just saying that they're all going to be there, they will be lost. And so I'm looking for the brief as an architect to move forward, to reinvigorate certain aspects, but I'm also looking for that scholarly brief in order to convince a client that it is important. I don't know if Bo and Kim Halliwell are here, but I had a client come to me and they said, we bought a piece of property, we love the property, we hate the house. And it was a Bo and Kim house. And I could have walked away from that because I deeply respect what they do. But I realized that I probably, if I don't say yes, someone else will do it poorly. That was kind of the line I had taken. Not that I'm the be all end all, it's just that I cared about it and I could work with the client to try and build out that story. Well, when Bo and Kim found out that I was working on the Smith 2 house, they raced to that house to make sure that I hadn't done to it what I had done to their house. So it was a bad, and they were relieved that I hadn't screwed it up like I screwed their place up. But it does reinforce the fact that scholarship roadmaps in regards to these buildings are fundamental to breathe life into the next generation and ensure these buildings carry on. And I think it's of great importance.
I think a central question to what Professor Van Duzer is asking is, what are the agendas of architectural history and architectural criticism? And if we add to that the question about Mr. Erickson's contributions to a field in the context of a nation, in the context of regions, then the scholarly mandate is to come up with a set of questions that can be answered through a careful interrogation of his practice, evidence and preserved in the 3 repositories of his archives. I mean, I do think, and I thank you, Ms. Weder, for saying that I did use the word hagiography, and I do, and I violated my own rule about allowing the personal to enter into what I see to be the obligations of scholarship and the criticality around looking at material. But the thing about Mr. Erickson is he was the most compelling person, and when he did tell you stories, you had to listen because you knew that they had meaning and they had value. And so forgive me for violating my principle, but I hope the Rob Feeney Lumiere story was enjoyable. I think if we think about Canadian architectural history, it's a bigger question. I mean, we live in a country that is profoundly wealthy, grappling with issues of decolonization and change. And I would say that architectural history in our country is woefully underrepresented. We have very distinguished scholars, Professor Liz Combe, others at McGill, and all who are writing. But the question about Canadian insecurity, I think, is always the quest for some type of national agenda, as opposed to situating the brilliant work of practitioners who happen to be Canadian or working in Canada into what Mr. Erickson always wanted to be, a global context about the obligations of architecture as a humane undertaking. And if we think then about what I think is the woeful understudying of Canadian architecture, Mr. Erickson is but a piece in a much larger puzzle and set of questions.
I have to confess that 15 years ago, when I arrived in Canada, I had been in academia for 20 years. Before that, I had never heard of Arthur Erickson. I'm an American and now proudly a Canadian. But I say that because I think, just to build on what you're saying, Michael, that not only is sort of Canadian architecture and Arthur's role in that sort of publicized, let's say, or underpublished, I think his position in an international, framing his work in a more international sense, not only focusing on the projects that he did abroad, but comparing his works to others internationally, just putting him in a larger field of scholarship, I think would be very beneficial for extending his legacy.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about the archives, and I've had the benefit and privilege of working in all 3, Mr. Erickson's office had extensive international contacts. He had a profound and deep relationship with Paul Rudolph. He and Ezra Stoller were very good friends. He communicated with the leading practitioners of his generation around questions of materiality, about spatiality, about form, about program. So there are these troves of revealing documents that are awaiting generations to come. And I thought Professor Kubo's lecture today was superb because it does situate Mr. Erickson in a larger context outside of Canada, where, yes, he is Canada's most famous architect and Canada's best architect. No argument that those characterizations are not true. But one has to get past that to what Ms. Weder is saying, a level of criticality where you can't be afraid to say that a building might not work, or that there might have been issues that are issues which in hindsight speak. But at the time, architecture, like any cultural activity, is temporal and shifting. So what might have been a good idea in 1965 and the sort of moment of thinking that characterized lots of practice 50 years on might look as, would have done something differently. But that's the role of the scholar, to sort of balance the past on its own terms and the critical eye of assessment that brings things into a meaningful present.
I agree with you, Michael, there, but on the other side too, internally, domestically, I think it's a tragedy that there isn't more historical analysis about his entire peer group and the architects before and after it, on the theory that a rising tide lifts all shifts. I think that he would be, his position would benefit if we continued to add more scholarship to, everyone that came before and after and during him. One of the great tragedies of recent years, in my opinion, is the demise of the architecture department at the Canada Council for the Arts, the annihilation of the architecture officer position, of architectural juries, and anyone who knows anything about architecture, the entire council, and the marginalization of it. A field, I've been involved with people, Graham Livesey and Elsa Lam, who have written letters of concern and protest that have gotten nowhere. If anyone wants to take up the fight, it's an important one. Scholarship was gaining serious ground under Brigitte Desrochers,
Yes.
and it just, all her efforts that were just making so much headway just when that got annihilated.
Important point. Thank you for reminding us of that. I mean, if I can offer one other thing, it's fantastic that everyone is here to think about Mr. Erickson's work and legacy, and importantly, the next stages of critical engagement with a practice, and as Ms. Weder says, in the context of a profession. I mean, Settler Canada and the building of structures for life has a deep history, and yet I think that there is something about the Canadian character where there's a holding back. And I would say the holding back, might be temperamentally admirable because there's a modesty, but there's also a smugness. But I think that if we thought about the contributions of people, settlers to this place, around the building of habitation, in the context of national agendas and regional agendas, there would be remarkable consequence, because we all live in the built environment. We walk around all the time seeing buildings. We can say, oh, I like that one, I don't like that one, et cetera. But each time we experience a building, we have an obligation to ask ourselves questions: the who, what, where, when, and why of that structure, and what's the context, and what do we do as citizens who might not want that building to be torn down, or as scholars who say it's time for that critical story to be shared with people, so that what happens to the Graham House doesn't happen to other things, about how Indigenous making is not celebrated and acknowledged in the way it should be. So there's a whole host of things, and I think that there's time for, I'm not going to say elbows up, because I think that's the worst phrase that's entered the political lexicon today, but I do think there is time, in light of what has been long-standing proto-Americanness in Canadian culture, and the idea that we are sort of a little provincial extension of a much larger giant, as opposed to saying there is a very distinct history in settler colonial Canada, and it's time for deep scholarship to bring those stories to public attention.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think I'm going to leave it on that, because that's an excellent closing statement. We are, at the end of this long day, not going to do a Q&A. There is a reception right outside, and we'll be there. If you have any questions to follow up on this session, please engage us. Thank you all very much.